Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I am joined by Brother Sulaiman Bulbulia in Barbados and our brother Sabir Nakuda, also from Barbados. Both these gentlemen have authored an interesting book, Historic Mosques of Bridgetwon, Barbados. I haven't read the book personally, so I'm hoping that, and I know many of you haven't read it outside of Barbados, those of you listening to this program. But we have these two gentlemen. I want to talk about these two mosques in particular, but the history of the mosques themselves and the circumstances in which they came about and why it was important to write this book. I personally, obviously, you know Suleiman and Brother Sabir. I visited Barbados, prayed at both those mosques, and you feel the history there. Why did you write this book, Sabir?
Assalamu alaikum to all my brothers and sisters. Not why I write the book, why we wrote the book. Because don't forget, Suleiman would feel that he is being left out. I think one of the reasons is that it is very important for this generation and also the future generation to know the history and the struggle that our ancestors, our forefathers made, especially under the circumstances when they were the economic situation was very dire in Barbados. They were under colonialism, and so they always had that urge and that yearning to have a mosque. Of course, as you know, Muslims, as fish cannot live without water, Muslims cannot live without a mosque. And so, although they were praying in their homes and they were getting together in somebody's home on Jummah Day and so on, but that yearning for mosque was always there. And so, although the circumstances, the financial circumstances was very dire because of the situation, they then, in order to get to meet each other, to perform their salah with Jamaat, I think for them it was very, very important. And so they took that that struggle, and so they decided to save money and so on in order to have a place of worship where they could get together, where marriage can take place with learning and teachings and funerals and other aspects of Islamic life, because mosque is the center of Islamic life. And so they struggled and struggled until they came to the position where they were able then, under the dire circumstances, and I use that word many times because that was the situation at that time, then they saved money, and then when they needed to go to other Caribbean countries like Trinidad and Guyana, they did so, and the people of Trinidad and Guyana readily assisted them, so much so that the ladies in Guyana took off their bangles and the chains and so on and donated to the mosque, the Sobers Lane Masjid or the City Masjid or the Medina Masjid. And so it just shows that it was not only the effort and the desire of the Barbadian Muslim community, but it was also the desire to assist by the Caribbean community like Trinidad and Guyanese Muslims, for which we are very, very grateful.
Right. I want to come back to a little bit about the Caribbean dynamics and the links between the Muslim communities in Barbados and in Trinidad and Tobago and in Guyana. But before I get there, I wanted to ask Brother Sulaiman, how long did it take? Because I know the date on the Jama Masjid is 1951 and the City Masjid is 1957. But I wanted to ask you, how long did it actually take to build the masjid, to acquire the land, and to build the masjid itself? Sulaiman?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you, Brother Nazim, for the opportunity to be here with you and with my brother Sabir to discuss this book, which we only launched 2 weeks ago. So I don't think many people would have got the chance to read it at all, but inshallah, you will get the chance. The two masjids in the city, in Bridgetwon, as Sabir was mentioning, came about from that yearning to have a place of worship. And as documented by Sabir in his other books, Bengal to Barbados, the first known Muslim came in 1910. And that was from Bengal. And then the Gujaratis came in 1929 and thereafter. So in the 40s, you saw a coming together of Muslims in various homes and so on to pray Jummah, to pray the Salah, and then that kind of spirit to have a masjid. The Sobers Lane Masjid was actually a property that was bought in 1950. And that along the same time, a property in Kensington New Road was also purchased. And so you had a purchase of a land in Kensington New Road, which is a Jama Masjid, where that is, and then in Sobers Lane, which are building a house that was formerly a house, and a number of houses were bought, and a musalla was started there. The Jama Masjid, I believe, only took about 6 to 7 months to complete, maybe a little more, because they cleared the land. The land needed to be filled. The road was actually not a road; it was a rough cart road kind of thing. But the land was also needed to be filled and so on. But they really pushed on it, and the masjid was built from local limestone blocks and so on. It was completed then in January 1951. At that time, the other masjid was the musalla, was the house that was going on for a while. They were doing prayers in the house, and that continued up till the mid-50s. And then they made a decision to tear down the houses and build the masjid in Sobers Lane. That, I think that project began mid-50s, after 55, 56. And then that came to the final opening in February of 1957. And so we have these two masjids, which were in the 50s, starting in the 50s and opening in 51 and 57, respectively. One of the points I wanted to make for your first question, why we wrote the book, I think it's important that we tell our stories. Our stories need to be told. And our new generation and generations to come need to have something that they can go back to and find information. If we don't tell our stories now, it's going to be harder for future generations to find the information. Sabir worked very hard on this, getting this information. It's over a number of years, and there's a lot of it is oral research, and it's interviews with people that have passed on. And he has those on cassette tapes. Now we're digitizing everything. And these are stories that we have to keep, because if we don't tell our stories, our story get lost and we don't know our history. And so it's important that we do that.
Yeah. You know, when you look back in the 1950s, across Guyana and the Caribbean, Trinidad, especially Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana, and in Barbados, you know, the level of Islamic literacy with people coming fresh from Bengal to Barbados, you know, was there a cohesive unity? Was there factions or groups or, you know, pulling things apart? What was the orientation and the level of religious literacy in Barbados at the time, in the Muslim community specifically, obviously?
So as you know, and even today, you find that the Muslims in Bengal are not so literate as it relates to Islam. You know? And so when the Bengalis first came here, but they have that zeal anyway. So when they came, you know, they had this, what's called the metal suitcase, and they had their Quran and their Musalla, you know, but they didn't have that knowledge. But that did not prevent them from praying their Salat at home. Because according to my oral research, and this book really actually is all oral research anyway, they were praying at home. And then on Jummah, they would get together at somebody's home, and they would then pray their Jummah Salah. And after that, they would then spend the whole day, you know, talking about their villages and so on. So there was always that cohesiveness, that unity, you know. So every Jummah, although they were from Monday to me, from 6 days a week or 5 days a week, but Jummah is a day that they take a day of rest, and they will spend time together. So there was this unity. And then, of course, when the Muslims from India came in 1929, of course, among them was Hufaz. And so they stayed with the Bengalis. And so they even designated a room for Salah. And so then the Gujarati, he was a Hafiz, Suleiman Kasuji, and he would lead the Salah as often as possible, because remember, itinerant trading where you work from morning until evening. So maybe they did not pray in Jamaat, Zahar, Asr, and maybe, you know, and maybe Maghrib and Isha and Fajr. but he would leave the Salah. And not only did they do that, because the Gujaratis were more knowledgeable about Islam, they then started to teach the Bengalis the basic Islam, the basic philosophy of Islam. And so after work, and you had this lamp, kerosene lamp, and they would use that and teach the Bengalis more about Islam and so on. So Bengalis also became more knowledgeable, more punctual in their prayer, because Gujaratis were doing that too. So there were this unity first among the Bengalis themselves. They were very conscious of their prayer, although many of them married to Barbadian women who remained Christians, right? But yet none of the Bengalis ever became Christian or give up their faith. And so when the Gujaratis came, it was even, they had more opportunity to learn more about Islam, maybe learn more surah, I suppose, and so on, and so that unity was there now is Bengalis and Gujaratis, because Gujaratis started to live with the Bengalis when they first came, and so that unity continues. And then, of course, over a period of time, then they started to live and go on different places to live and rent and so on.
And
But that unity was always there among both the Bengalis themselves and among the Gujaratis and the Bengalis.
Interesting. Suleiman, Barbados became independent in the 1960s, I believe.
1966, yeah.
1966, same as Guyana. So 1950s, 1940s and 1950s was a time of colonial rule, British colonial rule in Barbados. First of all, how did the colonial regime in place at that time, the governor and so on and so forth, look upon the erection of these two masjids in the heart of the city?
So as you may have known, or the coming to Barbados of East Indians was not like Guyana and Trinidad and other places in the Caribbean. It was not indentureship. We did not have indentureship in Barbados. The East Indians that came to Barbados came on their own, looking for economic, better lives and so on. And so when they ended up here, they enjoyed it, they loved it, and they stayed. Barbadians generally are welcoming people, the average Barbadian, and they welcome you into the society. At the higher echelons, the white planter class, the colonialists, may not look on you the same way, but the general Barbadian population was very welcoming. And especially by the nature of the business that the East Indian did when they came and they started the itinerant trading. They basically filled a niche that was not there by any stretch of the imagination. They came in, the average poor Black Barbadian person could not get credit in Bridgetown. They could not go into the stores and get credit. They had to buy cash, and that was difficult. What the itinerant trader did was to buy goods and sell them on credit and very generous terms. And you can't pay, they will come back the next week and they will collect small amounts. And that created a good goodwill among the population. In terms of consolidating themselves in the society, through the economic work, they did that among the Black Barbadians. It did cause furor among the white Barbadian planter class to some extent in the economics. They did complain about that. In fact, when we had the 1937 riots in Barbados, when people rose up because of economic circumstances, the inquiry into the riots after, there was a few reports saying, oh, it's the East Indian who is making the Blacks poor. They made that assumption and that wrong finding. So you had that happening. But in terms of our establishing our places of worship, there's no indication that it was opposed. There was no nothing in our research, in Sabir's research, that shares that you could not have built the masjids. There was no prevention on that. We gathered our money, we raised it, as Sabir said, and we built these two places, not with any sort of person saying anything in that regard, and it was welcome. And in fact, just one point I wanted to make: where these mosques were built was actually in the heart of the city, where where you find it in the heart of the city. You didn't go outside. We didn't go to some empty space. We went in the heart of the city.
Yeah, and the Muslim community lived closer to the masjid, so they were able to walk. Nobody had cars and motorbikes and all of that kind of stuff. So one of the reflections, and you've traveled in the Caribbean as well. a masjid, when it established in the time period that we're looking at in Barbados, could be a means of expansion or contraction. What do you think when you did your research? What did you find in terms of the Muslim community? Did it expand or did it contract?
So what we found, what you found, and I made the point at our launch, was that the Muslims, when they set up these two places of worship, they set it up as permanent places. It was not temporary. So for them, Barbados was their home first and foremost. It was not that they were here temporary making money and they're going back to India. They saw it as a permanent place, and they built the masjids in such a way that they were permanent, and not only for their generation, but for future generations. Yes, there was an expansion happening in the Muslim community, but primarily by those coming in, by those migrating to Barbados. So you saw from the 1930s right up to the 60s, 70s, 80s, Muslims still coming from Gujarat. And you had that happening. And then obviously you had now children being born in Barbados and accessing these spaces. Interestingly enough, Jama Masjid opened in 1951. Its expansion took place in the 1980s when it moved from being a very small, accommodating maybe 150 persons that can now accommodate 600 persons in the 1980s. City Masjid never expanded really. They maintained the footprint more or less. There's a little bit of expansion to the back, but maintain the footprint that it has, primarily because most of the Muslims in this street moved out of that street or were not in this vicinity, and they moved other places. But Kensington, New Road, where Jama Masjid is, most of the Muslims still live in that street.
Interesting. Let's segue into the 1960s and talk a bit about the role that these masjids played in the struggle for independence in Barbados.
Sabir?
Yeah, well, it was a political struggle, of course, but the East Indian Muslims, especially who are all itinerant traders, they played their part in making sure that the less fortunate Barbadian Black people would get the basic items that they could not otherwise had because of financial constraint. So if they needed something, let's say, khaki shirts and pants or something for wedding or for Easter, right? It was the Barbadian, it was the East Indian Muslims who provided those facilities and those items on a credit basis. And so they were like partners in poverty with the Black Barbadians.
Nazim, another point to note on independence, and it's interesting to note this, that when independence came in 1966, Muslims in Barbados did not leave. You had the opportunity to keep your British passport or go to England or go somewhere else. They did not leave. They were comfortable in giving up that British identity and taking a Barbadian identity and passport. And I think that is driven a lot by the fact that we had places of worship. We were welcome. We were given. We were like Barbadians. Even though we were migrants from India, they did not leave. Whereas in some countries you hear of the exodus of people. I mean, even in Barbados, there is that some whites left when Barbados became independent. They left and went to Australia and other places. The Muslim community did not. They stood and they became Barbadians in 1966, having a Barbados passport.
The other thing too, let me add to is that then the Barbados Muslim Association, they went to Errol Barrow, the first Prime Minister of Barbados, and asked him, what can we do for the Barbados independence? What gift can we give? They went. And he says, well, look, I would like to get a cabinet table, but made of mahogany. And so they got one of those old joiner, you call them, right? To make a mahogany cabinet table. And then present it to the government and the people of Barbados. And that cabinet table is still being used up to today. So that was the gift from the Barbados Muslim community to the government and people of Barbados. And the other thing you must remember too, that while the two mosques was built in the 50s, the Muslim population was no more than 100. And yet they made all these tremendous sacrifices and effort, right, to make sure that they are that they are here in Barbados to stay, and Barbados is their home, and they are going to play their part, positive role in making Barbados a better place for themselves, for their children, and for all Barbadians.
And when they would deliver the sermon at the masjid, in what language would they deliver the service? The Jummah khutbah, for example.
So all the two main masjids in the city and the two on the outside of the city since the 1980s, they do on the minbar, they do the khutbah in Arabic. They would either read from a book. The younger now, Maulanas and Sheikhs, they would prepare their own khutbah in Arabic. So on the minbar is in Arabic, either from a book or they will prepare it themselves. What has become a norm now, not happening before, I believe, but norm now is that you have an English talk before the khutbah on the minbar.
Yeah. And you know, Brother Sabir talked about in the 1950s. I remember when the Jami Mosque in Toronto was open on Bousted Avenue in 1969, the CBC did a story on their Eid prayer, and 60 people had shown up.
Wow.
And
Wow.
the CBC was amazed that 60 people had showed up for the Eid celebration at Jami Mosque, this downtown masjid. And I'm wondering how many people would show up for Jummah in the masjids back in the 1950s.
So you would find for example, when you had opening of the Jummah Masjid, they had two safs, so they had about 25 people come in to the first Jummah Salah. And the khutbah was read by Maulana Ismail Adam, who was the Imam of the Queen Street Masjid in Trinidad. And the Salah was led by Ismail Kofdiwala. So it just shows the amount of people that we have had at that time. And then when Sobers Lane was opened, of course, it was opened by Jalil from Trinidad, and they had a representative from Trinidad and Guyana and so on. Again, they had maybe over 30 people come into the Salah at the opening, and it was Asr time in 1957 on February the 8th or whatever it is. So because remember, as I said, the community was very small, less than 100 people when the two mosques. So between up to 1957, when the second mosque, City Masjid or Medina Masjid, there were no more than 100 people who were present, including the Bengalis.
One of the unique features, Brother Sulaiman, in Guyana and Barbados is the role of transnational missionaries, or da'i, as we say in Arabic. In most respected, His Eminence Maulana Siddiq, Maulana Alim Siddiqui, his son-in-laws, these people were transnational missionaries that anchored our communities in Trinidad and Guyana. And I was wondering what role, if any, transnational missionaries played in Barbados.
So you would have had that happening from the mid-60s onwards. So we had happening in Barbados from the mid-60s, you had the arrival to the Jama Masjid of Maulana Yusuf Pipawala. So he came as a younger person to teach and lead the prayers in Jama Masjid in 1965, I believe it was. And when he came, he brought the Tabligh Jamaat ideology to Barbados. And he really built that Tabligh Jamaat movement in Barbados from the Jama Masjid and then spread it to the City Masjid and around. And they also then took it into the other Caribbean territories, Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad. He's credited for really introducing the Tabligh movement in the area. So with him coming, you had that transnational movement of Muslims coming up in the 70s and 80s. And so you had that happening. What is unique also for Barbados and the Jama and the City Masjid especially was that you had a young Barbadian, Dawood Abdul Haq, becoming Muslim in the early 70s, maybe the late 60s. And that was at the hands of Muhammad Degia, who had invited scholars like you just mentioned to come to Barbados to a conference here. and they came, and he was very interested in Islam. He became Muslim. He went on to the Medina to study, and then he came back in the mid part of the 70s and was functioning at the city masjid for a little bit, teaching Arabic and even leading the prayers at time. And he engaged a lot in dawah. He was one of the first Black Barbadian, Afro-Barbadian Muslims engaging in dawah and calling people to Islam. And that happened at this masjid. Our book does document some friction with his work that he was doing, because he then began to clash with that East Indian ideology of what Islam should look like, and not necessarily, and also the prevention of women from coming to the masjid, which is still predominant in these two masjids especially. So that became a point of friction. And then he moved away from here to start the Islamic Teaching Center, and you now have the Islamic Teaching Center, which came about in the 70s.
And of course, he came to Guyana and spent several years here, where we benefited from his knowledge as well and his teaching. He was one of the regional transnational missionaries serving both in Guyana and in Trinidad before he moved to Bahamas. And then from Bahamas, he is now residing in the United States, which you can find that information and interviews with him on the ahmedehwaz.com documentation site. So if people are interested, obviously, that's where you go for a lot of that background information. And you know, basically, Dawood was obviously an interesting teacher and interesting scholar who basically exposed a lot of that internal contradiction in Barbadian society. What is the situation like there now at these two masjids in terms of women participation in the functioning of the masjid and the prayer that takes place on a daily basis in the masjid?
So still no access for females to the two masjids. Back in the 2018, there was attempts to, I mean, over the years, there have been a number of petitions and people having conversations around how do we have space for our females in the masjids. 2018 saw a concerted effort to have the management of the masjids, change their position to have facilities for sisters. That did not go down well with the management of the masjid, so that did not happen. What they did do in Jama Masjid was to create a space, not in the masjid, but outside of the masjid, opposite the masjid, for females. And what was happening, because what they were finding was that a number of Muslim tourists were now coming to Barbados. Families were asking where we can go for Jummah. They are accustomed praying the Jummah together as a family. They turn up at the masjid for Friday Jummah, and they're told women cannot come in. And what we had was some very embarrassing situations where either they had to stay in the car, go by a neighbor's home, a Muslim neighbor's home to sit. So they created a facility, but not connected to the masjid. So Wesleyan, small facility also, because some sisters started to come, but not again connected. It's a separate room that you go pray and you leave. So that still exists. I mean, the argument that is used by the management of these two masjids is that it's hard to put a facility after the fact. But I mean, it's something that can be done once there's the intention for it.
But also, let me also add that now, because we have An-Nur Masjid in Cave Hill, where there are facilities for ladies to come and say their prayer. And then we have a masjid in Christchurch, where we also have the facilities for the ladies too. So the An-Nur Masjid, that's in Cave Hill. Now we have the facilities for the last 2 or 3 years. There are facilities for ladies to come and pray Salah 5 times a day. There's a separate room for them. So let's see if any situation can change in Sobers Lane and in Kensington New Road.
Gentlemen, this was a spirited and interesting conversation, sort of a historical tour, going back to the building of these two historic mosques in Barbados. Beautiful island, beautiful people, beautiful culture. And those of you who are listening, please visit. Suleiman has been an intrepid traveler in the Caribbean, going from island to island. He knows the Caribbean very well. And do drop him an email if you come in to visit the island. and he can tell you where to get the best halal food. And thank you so much, both of you, for joining me today. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Jazakallah
you.
khair.
Thank you. Jazakallah.